Well, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and adaptive decision making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. Jeremy Butler. Dr. Butler is a kinesiology instructor and associate director of Project Flex at Northern Illinois University. His research focuses on the social cognitive factors impacted by martial arts training. He has over 24 years of martial arts experience, teaches control and arrest tactics at a police academy in Illinois, and he is the author of Stop Resisting, the Law Enforcement Officer's Guide to Proven Control Tactics, Less Lawsuits, and Building Community Trust Through Martial Arts. Dr. Butler, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks for making the time to talk to us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, now, would you prefer I call you Dr. Butler or Jeremy or...
Either is fine.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you start out by just telling our listeners a little bit more about you. Tell us about your background, your in martial arts, your law enforcement training background, and how you came to put these two things together.
Okay. Well, I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, and, I've always had a passion for martial arts since I was a kid. I started when I was about 12 years old. Wanted to start even before that. And so, I don't know, from the moment from my first class, I knew that, it was going to be a part of my life for the rest of my life. So it was just one of those, I guess, rare luxuries of finding your passion early on. And so, training a variety of styles. Karate was my base, but even that, everything I've trained has been in systems. So it really wasn't a pure, just this art. So it was always sort of a blend of different methods. But yeah, my formal foundation was karate. I also trained in some Filipino martial arts, of course, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, some Jeet Kune Do. So been all over, and when it comes to that, over the last 20 plus years. And then I'd say, as far as major milestones, growing up in Chicago, of course, I dealt with, some of the elements that comes with big cities, gangs and things of that nature, violence. And so when I applied for college and actually ended up going on college tours, it changed everything for me. It was man, there's a world outside of Chicago, so I was really drawn to academia, and so I completed my bachelor's degree at the University of Illinois, went on and completed my master's. And around that time, right after completing my master's, is when I decided to pursue policing. And this was ironically through martial arts. So I had started my own martial arts school where I was, and I met the chief of police when I was a student at Illinois State University for my master's. And, shortly after graduating, he was like, what do you have going on? I said, I started my own martial arts business. I'm teaching full time and I work part-time jobs. And he's like, you should consider law enforcement. And at that time, I did not really have any interest in that, but he kind of sold me on the idea, of considering it. And then I found myself at the police academy. And, from there, within a couple years into my law enforcement career, I noticed the tension that everyone notices in the police industry when it comes to civilian and police encounters with use of force. And with me being a martial artist and me being a nerd as well, academically, I was like, I really want to contribute to this and use my experience to see, what can be done with that. And so I decided to go back, pursue my PhD while working full-time as a police officer and while running my own martial arts business. And so that was a rough 4.5 years.
I bet.
Yeah. And then so 2020, finished my doctoral work. My focal point was literally on, how confidence, or how martial arts training or academy training impacts an officer's confidence, which we call self-efficacy in scientific terms. But yeah, so that was kind of the focal point of my dissertation. Had some pretty good findings there that I'll share, but yeah, so I mean that's pretty much me. In 2020, when I finished my doctoral work, I decided that I could do a whole lot more for the martial arts industry in the capacity of research and public speaking and training rather than actually being a patrol officer. And so I decided to go out of law enforcement and into the domain of training and research and public speaking and writing. So that's my journey.
All right. Well, what fantastic. I can imagine that was a busy time for you, trying to complete your PhD, run a martial arts school, and be in policing full-time. Those are 3 full-time occupations at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. It was rough, but I'm glad I did it.
Excellent. Well, and you came to my attention because I believe it may have been on LinkedIn. I think was where I connected with you. But I was looking at what you have some publications, but the one that really stood out to me and that I wanted you to come on to the Trainer's Bullpen to talk to our law enforcement training audience about is one that you and your colleague Solomon Wang published called The Impact of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Training on Police Officer Confidence in Use of Force Performance Perceptions from Officers Who Train. And I'll tell you why, when I read this paper, why it really stood out to me is, and you kind of touch on it in the introduction, Jeremy, to your paper, you talk about the frequency of these physical combative types of encounters that officers will experience with resistant subjects in the field. And as you quote in your paper from DOJ statistics, 74% of all use of force encounters fall into the personal weapon category, hands, feet, combative type of resistance. And I've been doing expert witness work for over 20 years now. And one of the themes, the unfortunate themes that I see repeatedly is when use of force encounters, hand-to-hand combative encounters become protracted, they become prolonged. Officers are forced, there's multiple consequences of that. And one is that their officers are forced to have to escalate their level of force in order to gain control, because we don't lose, right? We don't lose. So we have to escalate our force to maintain control or to establish control. And then what happens is injuries to both subjects and officers goes up dramatically. And in some of these encounters that I think could have been, had an officer had the confidence and competence to be able to control that resistance early on with effective force intervention, it would have not had to progress. And some of these encounters have become lethal force encounters because of that inability. And so this paper that you wrote, I was like, I really need to talk to you about this paper and these findings, because I think it speaks very importantly to this issue. So can you start with kind of the background for this study? How did it come about? Why did you want to look at this issue? And we'll go from there.
Yes, it's kind of funny. So this was my first independent research study post-graduate school. And to be honest, when I originally started collecting the data, I wasn't necessarily doing it with the expectation of publishing in a peer-reviewed journal, right? I was really more so looking for practical insights from officers who actually train in the martial art, because oftentimes we talk about this stuff, but I'm like, what better person to gain insight from than the people who are actually out in the field and that are training in these martial arts. So that's what kind of led me to want that. But it was a genuine curiosity into the insights of officers. But and then it was also for curriculum development for me. So as I was developing my training curriculum, I thought it would be great to get these insights. Also in my book, Stop Resisting, it informed one of the chapters in that book as well. So it was a lot of other variables here, but then I got so many participants. I had a pretty large sample of participants, considering we're talking police officers who train, how specific that market is. And I was seeing results that seemed worthy of academic publication. And so this is what made me, take the data and collaborate with Solomon Wang. We call him Dr. Sean, but yeah, collaborate with him because he's really good at, with the statistics side of things. He's also a martial artist as well. And so that's kind of how that came about. I mean, the core questions were really to get these perceptions, these officer perceptions of, techniques that are good for law enforcement. How does it impact your confidence, right, during use of force encounters? And then also one thing that I added in there, which I think will be important for martial arts instructors, was what motivates officers to train, because that's another variable that we have to consider is, we can say martial arts is great for cops, but if we can't get them to actually go and do it and take it seriously, then, what are we going to do here? So.
Right, and that certainly is a huge issue, right? I'm sure you saw that in your time as an officer, and I certainly did in my time in the academy. Is one of the most difficult things is getting officers to train on their own time. The common theme is that if the department's not going to provide the training, then they're not going to do it on their own, and it's an irony that an athlete will invest more time, resources, and effort into personal training to win a medal, and officers struggle to see the importance of investing their own time and money and effort for their own survival. And so you bring up a great point, and we'll be excited to talk about, what you found or what came through in your study as far as how does martial arts, how does BJJ help increase that motivation and enjoyment to want to intrinsically want to train. So how did you do the study? Walk us through that.
So it was via online survey. So really a lot of it was my connections in the martial arts and the law enforcement industry. So a lot of word of mouth, sending out emails. If officers who actively are in law enforcement and also are actively training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, would they be willing to do this online survey? And so just spreading the word, social media, networking, word of mouth, and really that's how it ended up working out. And then, so it just kind of, I was expecting to get, maybe 50 people, to respond to that, but then I ended up getting over 300. And I was like, wow, okay, right? So a lot of insight here. And so that's how that came about. And then as far as results, a lot of the results that were really robust for me were the more of the descriptive statistics, which kind of made it challenging at first when it came to moving it over into the peer review domain, to have more depth to the statistical analysis, which is where Dr. Wang was able to help out with a lot. But some of the foundational results that I think were not super surprising, but I think helpful from a practical standpoint was pretty much all of the things that you would imagine it to improve. It was pretty saturated as far as one-sided as far as people's perspectives. So for example, over 90% saw improvements, and these are officers who train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and are actively on patrol. So over 90% saw improvements in their fitness, in their confidence, as well as their performance as far as handling encounters. Mind you, this is a perceptions-based study, so it comes with this limitation that these are from their perspectives. But yes, just to see such significant, such a high percentage of participants essentially saying the same thing. Like, yes, this stuff is working for me, not only physically, but also mentally, as well as in my performance on the job. And another major thing with that was when I separated these questions out with those who had less than a year of training, we saw some of the same results where they were seeing rather quickly them actively training in the martial arts improve their overall performance as well as their physical and mental well-being. And then as far as motivations, which again, I think this is great for martial arts instructors, the top two were self-defense and fitness in terms of what motivated them to pursue Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and what motivated them to continue to do it. being able to remain physically fit or have an avenue for physical fitness, and then also having self-defense training. And what makes me think with this is, and I talk about this a lot in other interviews, and I've written about it, is that dual fitness benefit of martial arts, right? So not everybody likes going to the gym. Not everybody likes lifting weights, whatever. So to me, martial arts offers this unique benefit of giving some fitness benefit, right? It's a physical activity. It's a sport, arguably, in some cases. But it also gives you that added element of actual developing the ability to protect yourself, self-preservation. So that dual benefit, I think, is huge if you're thinking about the needs of a police officer. So I'm gonna pause there because that was a lot.
Right. No, that's great, and we will come back. I want to dig in more into the results of your study as well, because I think there's a lot we can parse out of that. So if I understand what you said correctly, you had over 300 officers that participated in this study, and you did it via a survey that you sent out. And so can you give us an idea of, like, what if I was to have received your survey, what type of questions would you have asked me on that survey?
Asked about your training experiences. So like your rank in jiu-jitsu. I asked about how long you have been training. There were some questions related to best practices. So like gi versus no gi training. Questions about how you perceived it impacted your performance, how it impacts your stress levels, things of that nature. So pretty much everything surrounding, I tried to hit on the physical side of things, fitness, for the sake of example, actual skill, right? And then also the cognitive side of things, right? So how it impacted your belief and your ability to protect yourself on the job, which is, your confidence, or you can say your defensive tactics, self-efficacy, right? How it impacted their stress levels on the job. Again, I asked about motivations for training, and then I essentially, started to just analyze those results and see what I could tease out. So I ran correlations, for the sake of example, between officer confidence, i.e., whether or not essentially it was like basically like a Likert scale, right? So from poor to excellent, like how would you perceive your ability to protect yourself in a use and force encounter on the job? And then, they select between those, for the sake of example. But some of the things that I found was correlations, significant correlations, positive ones, between confidence and time training / rank. In other words, the more time the more time training in jiu-jitsu, so someone who had 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, etc., or higher rank, which those correlate, obviously, the longer you train, more likely to have a higher rank. That came with an increase in confidence. And also, there was a positive correlation between their confidence and their number of use of force encounters. So the more actual physical encounters they had on the job, the more confident these officers were. So yeah, that's, I guess, in a nutshell, how that laid out. One other piece that was pretty big, I felt, was I wanted to know what techniques they felt were most applicable to law enforcement from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I had them pick their top 5 techniques. And so there were some interesting trends there as well.
Okay, yeah, and I have highlighted that because I do want to talk about that as we go along. So, Dr. Butler, did you have so you weren't just looking at BJJ then, or were you, like, did these officers have martial arts experience? Did some of them have BJJ and others Krav Maga or judo or whatever, or was it just strictly BJJ experience you were looking at?
It was strictly BJJ experience. However, I did have an open-ended question asking them if there were other arts that they felt were essentially comparable in effectiveness to BJJ. But the baseline for the study was that the criterion for the study was that you had to actively be training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, specifically Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and actively be a police officer. So
okay.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Thanks for that clarification. And you had a blend of all different types of experiences across very, very more newer practitioners in BJJ up to very experienced and high belt BJJ practitioners. Did you see any difference with respect to their self-efficacy, their perceived confidence based on the years that they had been performing in their martial art?
Yes. So as I said before, there is that positive correlation, right, for both. So skill set as well as, well, I guess this was specifically when it comes to use of force encounters, but the higher ranked they were, the more confident these officers were. Now, in doing a direct comparison between officers with training versus officers with less training, in this particular study, I can't think of, if I do have the results, I'd have to look at it. But I know in the study I've done previous to this, I did have that finding. The study I completed in 2023, comparing officers by martial arts experience, I found that those who had less than a year of training, in comparison to those who had more than a year of martial arts training, there was definitely a significant difference.
Okay, all right.
So those findings have been present, but in this study, I don't think we directly compared that.
All right, well, no, that's fine. What I'd like to do is, because I try to make all of these papers available on the Trainer's Bullpen website, so I'll definitely get that 2023 study from you as well, if possible, and we'll make that available for our listeners. So,
Sure.
With respect to the techniques, so the different types, you said you asked them which techniques did they feel were more applicable. So just a point of clarification then, these participants, they were not police academy recruits. These were operational police officers who responded to your study, right? So
yes,
when they're
saying
what maneuvers or what BJJ techniques do I use the most, they're actually speaking from a position of context and credibility. Is that correct?
Yes, they're speaking from experience.
All right.
Yes. But once again, even with that, right? The question wasn't which techniques have you used on the job, right? So the question was, what techniques do you deem to be most applicable to law enforcement, right? So, there's something that you have to consider there. But what I gathered from that, or how I would interpret that, would be, these are the positions, and then we can talk about the 5 positions, right? So this is, I don't know how many of your listeners are martial artists or understand Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but the core 5 were side control, knee on belly, mount escapes, and Kimura. And the interesting thing was I separated those who were below black belt and those who had black belts, and I got the same 5. The only difference was the order, right? The order of what will be the most applicable to least applicable. There was a different order, but they had essentially the same top 5. So I thought that was interesting. And the theme across that was one of control. So side control, knee on belly, mount, and jiu-jitsu, these are all pins, right? So side control, you're pinning across side, you're perpendicular in body position. Knee on belly, you're pinning with your shin or your knee across the person's lower abdomen. Full mount, your hips are covering their hips. So 3 of the 5 are control positions. And then an escape position, which full mount is a pretty dangerous position to be in when you're dealing with strikes. So full mount escape was the 4th one. And then the last one was a submission. So only one submission came up out of all the options they had. And that was a bent arm lock, which I would guess would be as a weapon retention tool.
Okay, all right, and maybe can you expand on that? How do you make the arm lock connection to weapon retention?
Okay, so the Kimura or bent arm lock is a position where you essentially, how do I explain this? You essentially create like a figure 4 around a person's arm. So imagine if somebody were grabbing an officer's duty belt. And the beauty of this is it really doesn't matter where you are positioned It's a pretty universal position, right? So, but let's say an officer ends up flat on their back. Subject is on top of them, maybe between their legs, and the subject grabs the officer's belt, the gun, right? So the officer would secure the gun in the holster, grabbing the wrist. They would reach up, wrap their arm around the subject's shoulder and grab their own wrist. And then they would fall back and literally pry this person's arm off of the gun. If you're having trouble with that, as a matter of fact, ironically, I guess you can say this is also a shameless plug, but on the cover of my book, I'm performing a Kimura. So for the YouTube viewers, this is a Kimura. As a weapon retention tool, even in this picture. So yeah. So that's the Kimura. That's the only position, the only submission that came up within the top 5 for both categories.
Okay, great. And on the issue of perceived self-confidence, self-efficacy, what did you see there as far as the results? And was there a difference between the amount of experience as far as the reported self-confidence as well, or what did you find?
I compared, as far as confidence is concerned, there were 2 core sort of comparisons. One of them was correlation based, as I talked about, right? So confidence in time training is correlated, confidence in use of force encounters correlated. But as far as comparisons between 2 groups, I compared based on actual force experience. So I looked at officers who had over 5 encounters on the job in comparison to officers who had less than 5 encounters on the job. So this is what I call experience-driven self-efficacy. And this is something I wanted to make sure was included in the study beyond just the martial arts training, but their actual on-the-job experience. And so I found that experience was a major factor as well, right? So officers who had over 5 encounters had a significantly higher confidence level than officers who had less than 5 encounters.
Okay. All right. And one of the things that you mentioned here, I'm just going to read a sentence out of your study. You say this growing body of research and potential transferability of the art, and you're referring to BJJ, to the needs of officers in preparation for force encounters has led to an increased interest from the law enforcement community. So what I want to just ask you about, because this is an important word, you talk about transferability and potential transferability of BJJ into the actual street fight that an officer is in. So what did you mean there about the potential transferability of BJJ?
Good question. So to me, I believe that essentially if you're in a hands-on use of force encounter, non-lethal, you are grappling. You are in a grappling encounter.
Right.
Is the bottom line. And I talk about this every academy class. I start with this conversation. Every speech I give, I talk about this. If you were to Google the word grapple or grappling, right, you will find that it says to seize hold of a person, to control a person, to wrestle with them, or overcome a difficulty or challenge, right? So to me, that's the definition of grappling. What is jiu-jitsu about? Jiu-jitsu is literally about control leading to submission. So you see the overlap there, right? If the ultimate goal, and what is the ultimate goal of a police officer when they're in a use of force encounter? Is to do minimum harm necessary to subdue a subject, right? Mm-hmm. If they're, if we're dealing with the use of force encounter. So to me, the idea is, why not pursue an art that was essentially designed to control the human body, right? And this is also why I bring up jiu-jitsu is I personally recommend jiu-jitsu as kind of the top. And the reason why I do is because of this emphasis on both top and bottom positions. So if an officer ends up on their back, jiu-jitsu has a robust system of methodology to, once again, control a subject from their back and from top. But that's not discounting that wrestling would be a great art for another grappling art for law enforcement. Judo is another great art for law enforcement. The only reason that I emphasize jiu-jitsu is because it places more emphasis on both positions, top and bottom, which if you are, for our smaller officers or for our female officers, the reality is we have to respect nature. right? So if you
Mm-hmm.
got a guy that's 100 pounds heavier than there's a good chance you end up on your back. And you have to understand how to use technique and leverage in order to control that situation from your back. So that's what I mean by that overlap and that transferability of skill set.
Okay, great. And I guess that's one of the reasons why what I wanted to I wrote down that I wanted to ask you, and you kind of already answered it, and you have experience in a lot of different martial arts. And so the question I was going to ask you was, well, why not judo, why not karate, why not Krav Maga, why BJJ? But I think what I'm hearing you say is when we look at actual street encounters, street fights, and I think the last statistic I read on resistance, if an officer gets resistance above, I'm talking meaningful resistance, real resistance on the street, over 80% of those encounters will very quickly end up on the ground with both officer and subject on the ground. So whatever if there's a martial art that it needs to be transferable to that environment, it needs to be one that provides effective skill in controlling, restraining, and escaping from the ground position.
Absolutely. But one thing I'll add to that too is, people often ask that, why not this, why not that? I think another thing to consider as a police officer is, do you have to limit yourself in that way, right? So I do think that a good base is a grappling art, and I think that if someone was to take my advice on that base being a grappling art, I think the number one to me is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But it's really more about the attribute, right, that people want to get. So it shouldn't even stop there, right? You have that base as a grappling art, but you should be incorporating striking. You should be incorporating weapons in that training, because the reality is on this job, anything can happen, right? So I don't think anybody should place themselves in a bubble. And I say the same thing to martial artists, right? When people say, oh, I'm a karate stylist. And it's like, okay, but why limit yourself in that way, right? Why not expand across all domains or all ranges, right? And build a skill set. So I just want to add that in there, that everybody thinks of me oftentimes as the BJJ guy because I put in a lot of energy and research into that. But that does not mean that I don't think people should pursue a striking art and a weapons-based art so that they can have a well-rounded understanding of combative situations.
Absolutely. I love how you phrase that. And that what you were talking about there reminded me exactly of what Bruce Lee used to say about the way of no way, which was what made Bruce Lee such a formidable fighter and opponent, is he didn't lock himself into any style or bubble, is he would use whatever was needed in that moment from any discipline. So
Absolutely.
You found, so when you're talking about self confidence, self-efficacy, you found in the results were dramatic improvements. I think the number that I saw there was like over 90%, 95% of the participants reported that heightened self-confidence and self-efficacy that they attributed to their BJJ experience. And what I wondered, and I sent you in our conversations back and forth, is what struck me is maybe there's a connection there, because you do talk about exposure to violence, in the importance of exposure to violence and that combative type of environment. And I thought about the parallel research in threat versus challenge states, is how when we encounter those environmental demands, and so for an officer who's facing somebody who's intent on hurting them and fighting them, is an officer will either perceive that as a challenge to lean into and solve, or they'll have an aversive response to it as a threat to want to avoid it. So do you see correlation, Dr. Butler, between when you're looking at self-efficacy and confidence, do you see how exposure to this type of training gives officers that self-efficacy, that confidence?
Yes, absolutely. So this falls into why I study self-efficacy theory. This comes from a larger theory called the social cognitive theory, Albert Bandura. And part of what it says is that your performance accomplishments or your experiences of personal mastery are the strongest predictors of your confidence or your self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is one of the strongest predictors of performance. So you see how they start to get connected there. So the more you experience success in a particular task, the stronger your confidence is going to be, right? It's going to be literally, that is number one. So there are multiple sources of improving your confidence. It's more than just performance accomplishments. So it's like how you interpret your emotional state when you're in that moment. Is social persuasion. So other people encouraging you, other people telling you that you're good at something, that increases your confidence. Modeling behaviors increasing confidence. So if you see someone who you can relate to that might be similar in age or stature, and you see that they can perform a task, you're more likely to believe that you can, right? So all of these are predictors, but the strongest is your actual experience. Now, why do I say that? You just talked about your challenge versus threat state theory. In that theory, it says people with high self-efficacy, perceive control, and focus actually perceive circumstances as challenges rather than threats. And when you perceive a situation as a challenge rather than a threat, you're inevitably going to increase your performance. So all of this kind of loops in a circle. So it's like high performance or it's performance experience or experiences of personal mastery, I should say. They are predictors of confidence. Confidence is one of the strongest predictors of performance. But when you have high levels of confidence, when you feel like you are in control of the circumstances that are surrounding you, and you feel like you're able to focus on what's going on, you're going to perceive a situation as a challenge rather than a threat. Now, why is that so important that we perceive a situation as a challenge rather than a threat? Because one, we just said it's going to improve performance, which it will, but we're also going to be more willing to engage in whatever that situation is rather than avoid that situation. So now let's put that into a police officer's context in a use and force encounter, and the subject might have gotten a jump on them, right? And they get struck and they fall to the ground. Someone who perceives this as a threat may immediately resort to the tools on their belt. They may immediately go for that gun and say, oh, I'm disoriented, I can't see, whatever. Someone who sees it as a challenge may say, oh, I've been here before. This person lands on top of me. Okay, now let me control position. Let me keep them from hitting me. Let me reverse the position. So you start to work your systems that you've developed from your training, from those performance accomplishments on the mat, and now you're able to handle the situation without having to potentially take a life, in some cases unnecessarily.
Right. I love how you phrase that, and I think this speaks to the whole pedagogy of the training environment, doesn't it? Is that because at the very beginning you talked about the tension that you saw in your police training, and I only assumed what you meant by that because just from my own lens and what is often seen as but a very sterile, non-contextual, rote repetition type of a non-aliveness in our police combatives training. And then we wonder, so if we go back to this phrase transferability, and we wonder why we see such a failure of transferability from that type of a nonlinear static training environment into the real world. And so I love what you said there, because I think if we can understand as trainers, and if there's agency executives, if you're responsible for training in your department or in your academy, is the more you can make your training alive, contextual, and meaningful as to what it looks like in the real world, you start to create officers who see those challenges in the real world. Like you said it so well, Jeremy, you said the brain says, it's okay, I've been here before. I can control this. And it's that agency of control and seeing things as a problem to be solved rather than a threat to be feared, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you had there's some other questions I want to ask you before we leave your study, but just based on this paper we're talking about here, the impact of BJJ training on police officer confidence in use of force performance. I want to put you, I'm going to say you've got the ear of an academy director or a law enforcement executive. You got their ear for, 3 minutes or whatever it is. Talk to us. What would you say to that person to try to convince them that adopting and integrating BJJ training into their officer training is important? How would you convince them? What would you say?
Well, I would probably start with the question. And I would probably ask them, what do they perceive to be the ultimate goal when it comes to an officer being involved in a use of force encounter? It's the ultimate goal, right? And more than likely, I would hope if they, if we're on the same page, that ultimate goal will be for minimum harm to be done, but for the officer to be able to handle the situation effectively, right? Now, or something along those lines, right? And so then with that in mind, I would say, okay, let's think about options here, right? So your standard use of force curriculum, right? Do you think that your officers are going to be more effective with accomplishing that goal? Let's say they get into an actual force encounter. The subject is attacking the officer. Do you think that they're going to have a better end result by striking that subject or by physically subduing that subject with positions of control, right? They'll probably say they'd probably be more effective by physically subduing by means of control rather than striking. Then I would agree. And I would say, okay, do you think that this officer who is doing this control will be able to be more effective at doing this by way of training in an environment where it's one of compliance, or training in an environment where we can simulate the circumstances that would happen in real life in a safe manner? Again, so you see, I would kind of lead them into the essence of what jiu-jitsu was about, right? And so my core argument here is, if we want, which my goal is for civilians as well as police officers to be safe during these encounters, both sides, both cops and civilians, to be safe during these encounters. What is the best means of making that happen when a civilian decides they want to fight the police? My belief is the best means of making that happen is for the officer to close the distance, manage the distance with the subject, gain control of them, prevent them from being able to strike the officer, prevent them to gaining access to the officer's weapons. This is another thing that we have to talk about, right? The officer's weapons, and allowing that subject the opportunity and the officer getting that subject in a position where he can actually talk to that subject. A position of such control where I can subdue and tell that subject, hey, look, I don't want us to do this. Can you please relax your arms from me? Can you please stop moving, right? So be in a position where they could do that. Now, how does this officer gain the ability to do that? The only way that they're going to gain that true skill is being in a training environment where they're simulating that circumstance, right? So to me, this is what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or this is what grappling arts that involve a live training allows for. It allows for me to be able to practice these skills in an environment where I'm still relatively safe, but I feel that real energy, rather than an environment where there's one of compliance, or an environment where I'm attempting to beat a person into submission, which rarely works out for anybody under those circumstances. I'm sure that was more than 3 minutes, but that's the general core idea.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And, when it comes to the striking techniques, I mean, what the research that has looked at officer and subject injuries is very clear on. Multiple research papers shows us that the highest amount of injuries after canine, which is the highest, we'll park lethal force, because obviously
Different conversation.
That's a whole different conversation. But when we're looking at intermediate weapons or strikes and stun techniques, striking and stunning is like it has the second highest injury outcome for subjects and for officers. So, for an agency executive, if we're actually really concerned about our police public relations and about making sure our officers when they have to use force, they use force that's proportionate, yes, and necessary, yes, but that is effective at establishing control, at hopefully minimizing injuries to the public and the officers. I think now we're having a conversation that agency executives' ears are really going to lean into and listen.
And I also think to see is to believe, right? So I think those who are like complete skeptics, I think being able to have an environment where you can demonstrate the effectiveness of these positions, I think is huge, because some people, they have to see it to understand it, right? That's why I showed you the picture on it. Like, I know there's some listener, when I was trying to describe the Kimura, they're like, what? Right? Like the bent arm lock, so many times people have to see it. So I also think that, like, with academy directors, if they are considering that, go out and check out, programs that offer this type of training, and then you can see it for yourself, right? Open up your mind to being able to explore these avenues, and then, the proof will be there for you.
Absolutely. Right, because our goal at the end of this is to make our officers highly resilient, adaptable, and professional performers in the field when it comes to these violent encounters.
And one more thing, I'm sorry, I want to say.
Absolutely.
So this also does not necessarily mean that, okay, let me put it this way. We have to define what it means to win as well, right? So no martial art is a magic pill, right? Again, if you have an officer that is 140 pounds, you got a subject that's 250 pounds, the officer isn't going to shoot in, take the person down, get them out. Like, it could happen, but to me, a win for that officer is they get out of that situation like unscathed. You would imagine that if you compare someone with who's 140 pounds and they have years of training, and you compare for somebody who's 140 pounds and they have zero training, and they're going against a guy who's 250 pounds, and this guy is actively aggressing toward them. To me, in that situation, we have to respect nature. Yes, there's a really good chance that despite all of the years of training that 140-pound officer has, they have a problem. If they have someone over 100 pounds heavier than them actively fighting them. But what is a victory in that moment? To me, a victory is that 140-pound officer being able to control the distance between himself and the subject, whether it be in too close or too far away, in such a way that that encounter ends with that officer safe and okay and surviving. And maybe they didn't even need to use the tools on their belt. They allowed themselves, they put themselves in a position where they can control the subject in such a way that allowed time for backup to arrive and for them to safely and effectively arrest that subject, right? So I don't want people to have the perception that if your officer trains Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, now all of a sudden they're this superhero, and all of a sudden, doesn't matter who it is, they're going to be able to take them down. I don't think that's the reality. We have to respect nature in this as well. But I'll put way more money on this officer having the skills to survive and manage that situation a whole lot better with training versus one that doesn't.
Very well said. Very well said. And we'll end looking at your study before I ask a couple other questions here. But one of the things that I underlined that got my attention is this. You said additional exploration might also investigate the potential benefits of the ecological dynamics approach to control tactics training in comparison to specific technique selection. Talk to us about that.
So, I don't know how many people have, been exploring this or know about this, but there's been a big jump or big, trend, I guess you could say, in the martial arts industry, and is trickling over into athletes, sports, and even law enforcement of this ecological dynamics approach. And the whole idea behind this, I'm no expert on this, but I do have some training in it. The whole idea is, rather than teaching specific techniques, it's more about understanding principles and concepts, right? So the training methodology is introducing constraints in the training environment. So, for example, rather than me saying, "Hey, I'm gonna teach you this particular takedown," I might say, "Hey, here is your task. Your task is to get this person on the ground." There are many ways in which you can do that, and then you allow the person to explore different ways in which they can accomplish that task. So that's kind of a general idea of it. And how do I feel about it? I'm going to be honest here. I feel that it's one of those things that they're on an opposite end of a continuum, right? So to me, there's this continuum. There's the approach of, let me only teach techniques and no live training and your robots. And then there's this approach of, okay, well, we're just going to play these games. I'm just going to give you these tasks, and then you kind of figure it out naturally, right? I think that there needs to be an in-between here, right? So I think that the people who are in this approach of technique only needs to move a little bit closer to this approach of this ecological dynamics. And then the ecological dynamics group should not make it seem as though it's the only way and you should not teach any techniques anymore, because I certainly don't think that is the way to go. So that's my perspective on that. I do think that we do need to meet in the middle when it comes to that. And so I brought that up because I do recognize that my study was, it can be perceived as a focus on techniques. I asked officers what are the top 5 techniques, and they gave me some techniques, right? So I do want to acknowledge that that's not the end all be all. It shouldn't just be techniques. It should be being able to adapt to the environment, right? And that's where the ecological dynamics approach comes in. So I'm not all in on that side. I'm not all in. I'm like, let's come together, right? So yeah.
Sure, right. And there is value that should be obtained from both of those perspectives, right? Because on the one end, on the ecological dynamics end, we certainly do want officers who are highly adaptive. If there's one environment that's nonlinear as an occupation, it's law enforcement on the street. And so quick decision making, adaptability, and looking and being able to solve problems quickly is very important. And yet there are more effective, whether you call them techniques or positions or maneuvers, there are more powerful, effective, and efficient ways of solving problems. So I like how you phrase that. We need to bring both of these perspectives together to find the sweet spot for creating a learning environment for good performance to happen.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. All right, I got a couple other questions. I can't believe it. We're coming up on an hour already, and I feel like we're just getting started. But I've been dying to ask you this question because I've seen a lot of, I guess, the increase or use of BJJ in law enforcement training, which I think can be wonderful. But in some of those, I have cautions or concerns because there's things that happen on the mats in BJJ training that is a completely different context and environment than an officer fighting on the street. And you already mentioned one of them, weapon awareness, situational awareness around weapons and weapon retention. There's multiple other threats that may insert themselves into the situation. An officer's goal may not actually be control. It may be just escape and disengage and get some distance. So how do you, as a BJJ expert and a law enforcement training expert, how do you bring the world of policing together with the BJJ skills to make sure that we are actually teaching officers within the correct context of how these skills come together.
Okay. So let me first say I do not consider myself a BJJ expert. Let me say that. I categorize myself as a martial arts expert, generally speaking, but in that art specifically, I do not consider myself an expert. And I also think that word is used often way too much. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I get your point. So to address the question, I think it's important that we keep in mind, once again, what is the ultimate goal? So rather than getting wrapped up in a particular martial art, is what is it about martial arts that should be attractive to law enforcement? I don't think the style should matter. I think what should matter is the attribute. Do you understand how to control the human body, i.e. grappling? Do you understand how to deal with when someone is using their human body to be violent towards you, like punching, kicking, headbutting? Do you understand how to deal with someone who is using any weapon, right, to try to harm you, including yours, right? So those are the sort of three, those are how I categorize martial arts. So grappling, weapons, and striking. So rather than saying this style or that style, it's more like, do you understand how to deal with problems in those three domains? And I think that's the big picture. Now, this is where we can fast forward and say, okay, here are some recommendations for some specific styles that might help you in that particular domain. And then you explore those styles, right? So that you can accomplish that goal. So my thing is, when the officer goes into a situation with that in mind, then it opens up their horizons and opens up their lens, right? So I wrote a whole chapter on this, right? And I talked about the training habits that transform control tactics. And I said, build your game around weapon retention, build your game around punch protection. Those are two. Training with intent is another one. Training with the use of force policy in mind. So all these variables should be there. Mm-hmm. So when you go and train, let's stick with BJJ because that's what this study was about. That's just what I've been focusing on. When you go and train in the BJJ school, you could be in an environment where none of that is present. I was. The school that I trained at, I'm a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and the school that I trained most in is arguably more of a sport-based school, right? The training environment is definitely more about learning jiu-jitsu as a whole, as a sport even in cases. Some applications to self-defense, but generally, it's a sport-based. Now, what do I do, and what did I do even as a police officer in that environment? While we were training sport, I was always thinking street, right? So if an officer ends up in an environment where, okay, your department, your agency isn't supporting training, you decide to get on your own, and you ended up at a martial arts school that they may not have a law enforcement program, but they do have, pick your art. Let's say let's say Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but they're a sport-based school. What you want to do, what I did, was when I was training, when I was going live, rolling, I would do little things and I would build my style around knowing that I'm a police officer. I'll give you an example. When I'm working from my back, start the guard position. Guard position, you're on your back. You have your feet between yourself and that person, or you have your legs wrapped around that person's waist. Overhook. Overhook is when you wrap up one arm. So I built my guard game. Game is like your style, what you like to do when you're training.
Right.
I built that game around me wrapping up the person's arm with my left arm. Why? I'm left-handed. So I know that on the street, my gun is on my left side. So I built my game around using that overhook, wrapping up their right arm with my left arm. And I would only do it on that side. Why? Because I know that's my weapon side. So when I get really, really good, I can still train sport. I can still do all of the submissions that I would normally do. And some of those submissions have nothing to do with law enforcement. Sometimes you just have fun. But I kept those little core principles in mind. I would never let a person's hands be free. So whenever I'm training with someone, I did not like hands being free. I always had some type of control over their hands in one way, shape, or form. because I know in real life, when hands are free, they have access to striking me, or they have access to drawing their own tools. So just little principles like that I can do within a sport environment, and people might not even notice that I'm doing it. Some do, but I can build my whole system around that. And I'm getting realistic training. I'm getting those benefits of being able to just enjoy it, right? And I'm not in the police control tactics room.
Right. Well, that's great advice. Great advice. And one other, I guess, kind of confounder to all of that as far as the law enforcement environment is controlling somebody or establishing control when there are multiple officers at the scene. And I know you've seen it, Jeremy. We see it all the time, videos after video of you've got 3 officers, 4 officers trying to deal with one highly combative individual. And what we often witness is 3 or 4 individual officers doing their own thing, and there's no coordination, there's no teamwork approach to dealing with this. So would this be another thing when you say, building your own style, or if you're bringing BJJ methodology in, is to also incorporate, hey, if we've got multiple officers, now how can we work together with these techniques, these maneuvers, to establish control quickly?
Yes. So that comes down to remembering the principle. And this is where, when we talked about that ecological dynamics, this is where it can thrive in that environment. So now we have now we can teach, we'll continue with jiu-jitsu. We could teach jiu-jitsu techniques, right? We teach them these different ways or examples of how to control the body. And then now we can introduce this activity or skill. Okay, now how can you apply that when the situation, now it's 2 of you and you guys need to control this subject, and then leave it at that. There's no technique here. You 2 need to control and subdue this person. Try to apply the principles that you learned to make that happen. Chest to chest connection, hip to hip connection, controlling limbs, whatever it is, whatever principles that you taught, how do you apply that, right? So to me, team tactics comes down to one, understanding the principles behind the techniques that you learn. Because again, there's your limitation of they pretty much calling it the information processing approach, right? The technique approach. So the limitation of that is, if you're just thinking techniques, some people may not be able to take that technique and apply it in different environments, which is not always true, by the way, right? That's a big assumption that someone can't do that, but some people may struggle with that. So I think for the team tactics, being able to get in an environment where these people can practice these skills together, right? So that does present a unique challenge for an officer, because if your agency isn't supporting training within a department, you may be very skilled. You may have taken it upon yourself, but then this guy that you're working with on shift doesn't know anything, and now we kind of end up working against each other, right? So ideal world, you have an environment where you guys can train. You guys should be training these variables. And again, you guys should set, the academy, or not academy, but could be academy, but the in-service trainer, whoever the defensive tactics instructor is, should be running drills and scenarios where it's like, all right, guys, so you guys on him, control and subdue, right? Go, and then explore. And then let them experience failure or success, and then talk about it. Why did we fail? What are some things that you would do differently next time? And then now these things start to organically come out. This is where I like the ecological dynamics approach. This is an example of where that could thrive, right? So there you have it, and that's what it comes down to. Now on the opposite end, when you don't have that support, when it's just you and you got an officer who you really don't necessarily trust, I think this is where communication is really important, right? You're going to be able to, if you're training consistently, you're going to be able to remain relatively calm in that situation, or at least perform under that pressure. So maybe you have to step up and be the leader in that moment, and you tell that person what you need them to do in that moment, and you're going to be playing that primary role. So it's that matter of hey, I need you to grab his legs, and then maybe that's all you give them, grab the legs, and then you do the rest. And once they've got those legs locked together, it's not that hard to get a person to the ground. So things like that.
Right. Okay. Oh, that's That's super helpful. And Dr. Butler, we've been going for just over an hour already. So unfortunately, we're going to have to bring this interview to an end. But I'd like to give you the last word before I wrap it up. Is there anything that you wished you would have had the opportunity to say, or anything you want to say that's come up in your mind as we've been talking?
No, not specifically. I know you got me fired up. If you notice, it's a very, very passionate topic for me.
Of course.
So I do think it was a great conversation. I hope the listeners appreciated it. And if anybody needs to, or anybody would like to reach me, you can reach me at info@jeremybutlerphd.com. That's my email, info@jeremybutlerphd.com. You can visit my website, jeremybutlerphd.com, for information on training or any of the resources that I provide, including my book as well as my publications that I've done.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Butler, thank you again for making the time to talk to us on the Trainer's Bullpen. We greatly appreciate you and everything you're doing to help advance law enforcement.
Thank you.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainer's Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.